Our 10th wedding anniversary was a battlefield of silent judgment, a feud 5 years in the making. But a single phone call, answered on speaker, was about to detonate every unspoken resentment. The silence in our dining room was so thick you could have carved it with the steak knives we were all pretending to use. On one side of the polished mahogany table sat my parents, their smiles as stiff and fragile as old porcelain. On the other side sat Steve's parents, their expressions carved from granite. And in the middle, at the head of the table, was my husband, Steve, presiding over the misery like a king on a throne of thorns. This was our 10th wedding anniversary dinner, and it felt more like a parole hearing. The feud, the Great Schism, as I sarcastically called it in my head, had been raging for 5 years. It all started with Steve's younger brother, Leo. Leo was the artist, the dreamer, the one with a heart too big for his own wallet. He'd asked Steve for a loan to start a small gallery, a fairly significant amount, but nothing that would have dented Steve's burgeoning tech empire. Steve, ever the pragmatist, the man who saw life as a series of calculated risks, refused. He called Leo irresponsible, a financial black hole. He said giving him money would be enabling his failure. The words were like acid. Leo was devastated. His own parents, who worshipped the ground Steve walked on because he was the success, sided with their older son. They told Leo to grow up, to get a real job. My parents, who had always adored Leo's gentle spirit, were appalled. They offered Leo the money themselves, but his pride was too wounded. He packed a bag a week later and just disappeared. A postcard from somewhere in Oregon a year later was the last anyone heard from him. Ever since, our family gatherings had been exercises in carefully constructed torture. Steve's parents blamed mine for coddling Leo and encouraging his flaky behavior. My parents saw Steve as a cold-hearted tyrant who broke his own brother, and I was the demilitarized zone, constantly trying to broker a peace that was never going to happen. Tonight, Steve was in rare form. He'd just closed a massive deal and was radiating an aura of smug invincibility. He kept steering the conversation towards his achievements, his new car, the upcoming vacation to Monaco he was planning for us. Each word was a subtle dig, a reminder of who was the winner, the one who made the right choices. My father's jaw was clenched so tight I was afraid he'd crack a molar. My mother was pushing a single pea around her plate with her fork, her eyes glistening. "You see," Steve said, raising his wine glass in a mock toast, "it's all about discipline. You can't just throw money at feelings. That's not how the world works." He looked directly at my father, a cruel little smirk playing on his lips. That's when his phone, sitting face up on the table beside his plate, buzzed and lit up the room. We all flinched at the sudden noise. Steve glanced at it, his brow furrowing in annoyance. The screen showed an unknown number, no caller ID. "Probably another marketing drone," he muttered, ready to dismiss it. But then he stopped. A strange look crossed his face, that performative look he got when he wanted to make a point. He wanted to show everyone how unbothered he was, how even an interruption like this was beneath him. "You know what? Let's have some fun," he said, a dangerous glint in his eye. He picked up the phone. "Steve, don't," I whispered, a cold dread washing over me. "Just ignore it." He waved my concern away. "It'll be quick." And with a theatrical tap of his thumb, he answered the call and activated the speakerphone. The sterile beep of the speaker engaging echoed in the silent room. For a second there was nothing but static, a faint, distant hiss. I held my breath. My mother had frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth. Steve's father had a look of deep disapproval. Steve himself leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smile on his face, ready to coldly dispatch whoever was on the other end. Then a voice crackled through the tiny speaker. It wasn't a man's voice, not a telemarketer. It was a woman, and her voice was trembling, thin and reedy, like a thread about to snap. "Hello?" she whispered, the word choked with what sounded like tears. Is this Stephen Miller?" Steve's smile faltered. No one called him Stephen. It was the formal name he used for legal documents, the name that belonged to a past he'd worked hard to bury. The entire table was frozen, a tableau of suspended animation. "This is he," Steve said, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier arrogance. It was tight, cautious. "Who is this?" There was a pause on the other end, punctuated by a shaky, wet intake of breath. The woman was clearly sobbing. We could all hear it, the raw, unfiltered sound of grief echoing from the phone in the center of our ruined anniversary dinner. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Something was terribly wrong. Then the woman spoke again, her words tumbling out in a broken rush, each one a hammer blow against the fragile silence of the room. "My name is Clara," she wept. I'm so sorry to call you. He made me promise. He made me promise I wouldn't call unless it was the end." The end. The words hung in the air, vibrating with unspoken terror. Steve's face went from ruddy and confident to a ghastly, waxy white. He looked like a statue of himself. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was his mother, Eleanor, who broke the spell. A strangled sob escaped her lips, a sound of pure maternal anguish that cut through the years of bitterness. She whispered a single name, a ghost on her breath. "Leo?" On the other end of the phone, Clara's crying hitched. "Yes," she choked out. "It's Leo. He's in the hospital. In Portland, Portland." The postcard. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I gripped the edge of the table. For 5 years he'd been just a few states away. Not lost in some foreign country, but right there. Steve finally found his voice. It was raw, unrecognizable. "What hospital? What's wrong with him? Put him on the phone." The commands were automatic, the desperate grasping of a man who was used to being in control and had just realized he was in free fall. "You don't understand," Clara's voice pleaded, frantic now. "He can't talk. Oh, God, he's been so sick for so long. His heart. He was born with a weak heart. He told me you knew." I looked at Steve's parents. Richard, his stoic father, had buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. Eleanor was openly weeping, her carefully applied makeup tracing black rivers down her cheeks. They knew. Of course they knew. It had been a childhood concern, something we all thought he'd outgrown, something that had been conveniently forgotten when it was time to call him a failure. "He didn't want you to know how bad it got," Clara continued, her voice a torrent of grief and exhaustion. "He was so proud. He didn't want to be a burden. He said you'd see it as another weakness, another excuse." She wasn't just talking to Steve. She was talking to his parents, to the years of judgment that had driven Leo away. The accusation was as clear as if she'd screamed it. My own mother reached across the table and took my hand. Her touch was an anchor in the swirling chaos. My father stared at Steve, and for the first time I didn't see anger in his eyes. I saw a profound, devastating pity. "Why are you calling now?" Steve demanded, his voice cracking. He was holding the phone with both hands, his knuckles white as if it were a lifeline. "The doctors," Clara sobbed. "They said there's nothing more they can do." The infection. His heart is too weak to fight it. They said it's a matter of hours, maybe a day, if he's strong hours. The word landed like a physical blow. Not weeks, not days, hours. The life of the man we had all, in our own ways, failed was now being measured in the same units as our miserable, pretentious dinner party. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. Steve staggered back a step from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He looked around the room, at his weeping mother, his broken father, at my parents' horrified faces. He looked at me, and his eyes were hollow, stripped of all their pride. He was just a man, a brother, who was 5 years and 1,000 miles too late. What can I do?" he stammered, the question a desperate prayer. "A private jet? I can get him the best doctors, I can fly them there, I can—" "No," Clara cut him off, her voice suddenly firm, sharpened by the urgency of a dying wish. "It's past that. He has a nurse with him. She's been wonderful. But there's one thing. One reason he made me call you." A heavy silence fell over the room again. All of us, the two warring families, united for the first time in 5 years by the disembodied voice of a stranger on a speakerphone, leaned in to hear the final verdict. "He's not conscious, not really," Clara whispered, her voice cracking with the effort. "But he's restless. He won't settle. The nurse says, she says sometimes people hang on. They wait for something, for permission." She took another shaky breath, and the next words she spoke were aimed directly at Steve, a last desperate plea from a dying man, delivered by proxy. "He's fading, but he keeps asking for you, Stephen. He just keeps whispering your name. The nurse thinks, she thinks he's waiting for your voice to let go. Let go." The phrase wasn't a comfort, it was a death sentence, and Steve was being asked to sign it. He swayed, and I instinctively shot out of my chair to steady him, my hands on his arm. It felt like he was trembling on a cellular level. All the money, all the power, all the success he had built his entire identity around had just been rendered utterly worthless. He couldn't buy his brother more time. He couldn't negotiate a better deal with death. All he could do was speak into a phone and give his dying brother permission to leave him forever. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, his eyes wide and wild. "No, I'm not. I can't. Stephen, please," Clara begged from the speaker, her voice frayed with desperation. "He's in pain." "You can't see it, but I can. He's fighting so hard, and there's no fight left to win. Please, just talk to him. Let him hear you." My father, a man who hadn't spoken a civil word to Steve in 5 years, stood up. He walked around the table and placed a heavy hand on Steve's other shoulder. "Son," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have to." For Leo, that was it. Hearing my father call him son seemed to shatter the last of Steve's composure. A raw, guttural sob tore from his throat. He collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands, the phone still clutched in one of them. His whole body shook with the force of his weeping. It wasn't the controlled, dignified grief of a powerful man. It was the messy, ugly, soul-crushing sorrow of a little boy who just realized he'd broken something that could never be fixed. Eleanor, his mother, came and knelt by his chair, her own tears forgotten as she tried to comfort her firstborn. "My boys," she wept, stroking his hair. "My 2 boys." Richard stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, his face a mask of regret, so profound it was terrifying to look at. In that moment, the feud was gone. There were no sides. We were just 2 families, bound together by a tragedy we had all helped create. "Give me the phone, Steve," I said softly, gently prying it from his clenched fist. He let it go without a fight. I held it up. "Clara? Are you still there?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'm here." "I'm Sarah, Steve's wife," I said, trying to keep my own voice from breaking. He needs a minute. Can you put the phone to Leo's ear? Can you do that for us?" There was a rustling sound on the other end, the gentle murmur of Clara's voice speaking to someone else, probably the nurse. Then, quiet. "Okay," she said, her voice softer now, closer. "It's there. He can hear you." I looked at Steve. He was looking back at me, his eyes pleading. He couldn't do it. Not yet. I nodded, understanding. I knelt down beside him, opposite his mother, and spoke towards the phone, pitching my voice to be as calm and loving as I could. "Leo? It's Sarah. We're here. We're all here, sweetheart. We love you so much." Behind me, I heard my mother start to cry. "Leo, darling," she called out, her voice wobbling. "It's your Aunt Carol. We miss you. We've missed you every single day." One by one, they spoke. Steve's father, Richard, his voice gruff and choked with tears, managed a broken, "Forgive me, son. Forgive me." Even my own stoic dad spoke, his voice cracking as he told Leo how proud he'd always been of his kind heart. It was a chorus of remorse, a flood of love, 5 years too late, pouring through a tiny speaker into a quiet hospital room hundreds of miles away. Through it all, Steve just knelt there, listening to the eulogies for a brother who was still, technically, alive. Each loving word seemed to wound him further, a testament to everything he had withheld. Finally, the voices died down. The only sound in the room was our ragged breathing. Clara's voice came back over the line, impossibly gentle. "He heard you." I think his breathing is a little easier." A small, fragile gift. "But it's Stephen he's waiting for." I looked at Steve. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing tears. He took a deep, shuddering breath and straightened up. He looked at each of us, at the circle of weeping family, and then he nodded. He was ready. I handed the phone back to him. He held it to his mouth, his thumb hovering over the mute button as if he was afraid of what he was about to unleash. He took one more breath, a final preparation for the hardest thing he would ever have to do. He cleared his throat. "Leo," he began, his voice a raw whisper. "Leo, it's me. It's your big brother." He paused, swallowing hard against a fresh wave of grief. "I'm here, buddy. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for—" But he was cut off. Not by Clara, not by static. A new sound came from the phone's speaker. It was faint, labored, and papery thin. It was the sound of a single, drawn-out, gasping breath. It was followed by a weak, fluttering cough, and then a voice. A man's voice. It was barely a whisper, a thread of sound so frail it was almost imaginary. But it was undeniably him. It was Leo. And he spoke one single agonizing word that shattered us all. Why? The word why was not a question. It was the distillation of 5 years of pain, a lifetime of feeling misunderstood, all condensed into a single whispered syllable that echoed in the dining room like a gunshot. For a heartbeat, nobody breathed. We had been speaking into a void, offering our apologies to a memory, to a man we thought was already gone. But he was there. He had heard. And he was asking for an answer none of us had. Steve froze, the phone trembling in his hand. The apology he had prepared, the words of love and letting go, died on his lips. How do you tell your dying brother it's okay to go when he has just asked you to justify why you broke his heart? It was my mother who reacted first. She pushed her chair back and hurried into the living room. She came back a moment later with her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "What's the hospital name, Clara?" she asked, her voice sharp and focused, a general taking command of a battlefield. "Mercy West," Clara's voice replied, sounding as stunned as we were. "But he—" "There's no time for buts," my mom said, not unkindly. "Steve, talk to him. Keep him talking. Just keep him on the line. Don't you dare hang up." Steve stared at the phone as if it were a venomous snake. Then he looked at my mother, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and something inside him shifted. The shell-shocked grief gave way to a sliver of hope, a desperate, impossible flicker in the dark. He took a ragged breath and brought the phone back to his lips. "Leo? I'm here. Don't go anywhere, okay? Just stay with me," he said, his voice pleading. "I was a fool. I was an arrogant, stupid fool. I was so focused on being right, I forgot to be a brother. There's no good reason, Leo. There's no excuse. There's just me, being sorry. Can you hear me?" A faint, almost imperceptible sound rustled over the speaker. It might have been a breath. It might have been a yes. It was enough. For the next 2 hours, our dining room transformed into a crisis command center. My father was on his phone, using his old corporate connections to charter a private plane out of a nearby executive airport. Steve's father, Richard, was speaking to a cardiologist he knew, a top specialist at Johns Hopkins, relaying the scant information Clara could provide. Eleanor and my mother were a whirlwind of logistics, booking hotel rooms, coordinating with the hospital, and packing a go-bag with a frantic energy I'd never seen before. And through it all, Steve sat at the table and talked to his brother. He didn't hang up. He told Leo about his life, not the curated success stories he told at dinner parties, but the real stuff. The fears he had about his company, the dumb mistakes he'd made, the time he'd almost burned the house down trying to use the grill. He talked about their childhood, reminding Leo of the treehouse they'd built, the secret handshake they had, the time Leo taught him how to skip stones. He talked for hours, his voice growing hoarse, his words a constant, desperate stream meant to be a lifeline, an anchor to keep his brother tethered to the world. He was pouring every unspoken word from the last 5 years into that phone. By the time the car arrived to take us to the airport, a plan was in motion. The specialist from Johns Hopkins was flying to Portland to meet us. The hospital had been alerted. There were no promises, only a sliver of a chance. As we all stood to leave, the anniversary dinner forgotten, the plates of cold food, a relic of a life that no longer existed, Steve paused. He was still on the phone. "I'm coming, Leo. he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I'm on my way. You just have to hold on. You hear me? You hold on for me." The flight was a blur of tense silence. We landed in Portland in the pale pre-dawn light. Clara met us in the hospital lobby. She was a small, tired-looking woman with kind eyes filled with a grief that felt ancient. She hugged Steve's mother, and the two women just held on to each other and cried. She told us Leo had slipped back into unconsciousness shortly after speaking, but his vitals, miraculously, had stabilized. He was holding on. We didn't get to see him until the specialist arrived and had consulted with the local team. We sat in the waiting room, the two families that had been at war just hours before, now huddled together, sharing coffee and fear. There were quiet apologies exchanged. Hands were held. Years of anger and resentment had been incinerated in the crucible of that single phone call. Finally, the doctor came out. He was exhausted, but his eyes were clear. "He's incredibly weak," he said, his voice low. "The infection is severe. But the man has the heart of a fighter. We think there's a procedure we can try. It's risky, very risky. But it's his only shot." Steve didn't hesitate. "Do it." The next few days were agonizing. Leo survived the procedure, but he was still in a coma. Steve never left his side. He sat by the bed, holding his brother's hand, sometimes talking to him, sometimes just sitting in silence. We all took turns, but Steve was the constant vigil. One afternoon, about a week later, I came into the room with fresh coffee. Steve was asleep in the chair, his head resting on the edge of the mattress, his hand still holding Leo's. As I watched, I saw Leo's fingers twitch. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. He looked around the room, confused, his eyes finally landing on his brother. His voice was a dry rasp, but it was clear. "You came," he said. Steve woke with a start. He looked at Leo and his face crumpled. "I told you I was coming," he choked out, tears streaming down his face. "I told you to hold on." Leo's recovery was long and slow, but he did recover. The families rallied around him. My parents helped Clara, who turned out to be the quiet, steady love of Leo's life, turn his small, struggling gallery into a thriving local arts hub. Steve's parents, humbled and full of remorse, rediscovered the gentle son they had nearly lost. But the biggest change was in Steve. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He had been given the rarest of gifts, a second chance. He funded a new cardiac wing at the hospital and set up a foundation to support struggling artists, all in Leo's name. Our family dinners are different now. They're loud and messy and full of laughter. Last week, on what we now call our real 10th anniversary, we were all gathered in Steve and my backyard for a barbecue. Leo, looking healthy and happy, was showing my dad his latest painting. Steve was at the grill, arguing playfully with his own father about whether the burgers were done. He caught my eye from across the lawn and smiled. It was a real smile, open and full of a light I hadn't seen in years. Later that evening he pulled me aside. "You know," he said quietly, "for 5 years I thought the worst thing in the world was failure." He looked over at his brother, who was now laughing with my mom. "I was so wrong. The worst thing in the world is succeeding at all the wrong things." He squeezed my hand, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "That call, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning." And as I looked at our two families, finally whole, finally healed, I knew he was right.